In 1995, in the heart of Charleston, $2.5 million in cash vanished from a millionaire's armored car. It seemed impossible. The vehicle was equipped with alarms, GPS tracking, and constant security patrols. Yet the money disappeared as if it had never existed. The millionaire, Richard Langford, was a self-made tycoon in shipping and logistics. His armored car was parked daily in a reinforced garage behind his estate, accessible only via coded keypad and biometric scanner. Inside the car were 3 industrial-grade cash containers, each weighing roughly 22 kilograms. The containers were locked with mechanical combinations and electronic alarms, all meticulously logged by a rotating team of 4 security personnel. Richard Langford was methodical and cautious, yet he trusted the wrong people. Among them was Mark Rivers, his logistics manager, a man under financial pressure, responsible for handling the cash transfers and familiar with every security procedure. On paper, Rivers was reliable. In practice, his desperation and ambition made him vulnerable. Tony Hawk DeLuca, a local ex-military operative turned planner of low-profile heists, had observed the estate for months. He had memorized patrol rotations, camera angles, and the armored car's routines. With him were 2 accomplices, skilled and patient, ready to strike at the perfect moment. Days before the heist, a neighbor, Alan Parker, noticed unusual vehicles lingering near the estate but thought little of it. She had no idea she would later become the only witness to the crime. The night of the heist arrived. At 2:12 a.m., Rivers conducted a routine inspection of the armored car, unaware that Hawk's team was already in position. 15 minutes later, the armored vehicle's combination locks were quietly manipulated. The accomplices on motorcycles slipped into the garage. One swapped the containers with identical decoy cases while the other monitored the doors. Every movement was timed to the second. By 2:50 a.m., the containers, now filled with harmless materials, were loaded onto the motorcycles and whisked away. Security logs later indicated no anomaly. Digital entries had been manipulated. Only Ellen, peering through her window, glimpsed shadows passing silently through the garage. She would later write, 2 bikes barely moving like ghosts on the street. The money was gone. The motorcycles were abandoned at a predetermined lot, and the trail went cold. For 20 years, the stolen cash remained hidden, untouched, the heist unsolved. Mark Rivers wrestled with guilt and fear, writing in his journal, "I am trapped in their plan. If they fail, I'm done. If they succeed, maybe I survive." Meanwhile, Hawk moved with calculated calm, knowing the heist had gone exactly as planned. Years later, new intrigue surfaced. In 2015, an anonymous envelope appeared in Langford's mailbox. Inside was a faded photograph of the motorcycles outside the garage on the night of the theft, with coordinates scribbled on the back. Questions resurfaced. Who orchestrated the heist? Was Rivers a willing participant or coerced? And most importantly, where was the missing $2.5 million? The mystery was far from over. The first clues of a 2-decade-old crime had suddenly reappeared, setting the stage for revelations that would shake Charleston and everyone involved. 20 years had passed since $2.5 million in cash vanished from a millionaire's armored vehicle in Charleston. For 2 decades, the trail had gone cold, the perpetrators unknown, and the stolen money unaccounted for. The case had become a cautionary tale among local law enforcement, a reminder that even the most meticulous security could be undone by human cunning and carefully exploited weaknesses. Richard Langford, now in his 70s, had grown increasingly reclusive. The theft had left a lasting mark on him, one that no insurance payout or financial recovery could erase. For years, he had avoided public appearances, leaving the estate and his business operations in the hands of trusted associates. Yet, the mystery of the missing cash haunted him nightly. "I always knew someone was watching the shadows," he murmured to himself on sleepless evenings. "But I never imagined they'd stay hidden for this long." The spark that reignited the investigation was almost absurdly mundane. One morning in early 2015, an envelope arrived at Langford's mailbox. Its presence was unusual, the return address was absent, and the paper smelled faintly of aged tobacco. Inside was a photograph, 2 motorcycles parked outside the estate garage on the night of the heist, frozen in time by grainy film. Scrawled on the back were coordinates, precise but cryptic. They did not correspond to any known Langford property or bank. Langford's first reaction was disbelief. He had assumed that all traces of the heist were long gone, that time had buried the criminals and the money alike. Yet, holding the photograph in his hands, he felt the same tension he had felt 2 decades prior. "It's them," he whispered. "They've left a breadcrumb." He immediately contacted Detective Simon Hargrove, a veteran investigator known for his meticulous attention to cold cases. Hargrove had seen hundreds of thefts in his 30-year career, but few had the precision, audacity, and mystery of the Langford heist. He reviewed the original case files, security logs, photographs, witness statements, and the archived journals of Mark Rivers, Langford's logistics manager. He noted inconsistencies long overlooked: a 12-second blackout in security footage, discrepancies in container weight logs, and a note by Rivers that hinted at fear of retribution. Hargrove's team began by retracing the movements of known associates from 1995. They discovered that Tony Hawk DeLuca, the ex-military operative and mastermind, had vanished shortly after the heist. His last known residence had been abandoned. Neighbors recalled unusual activity around the time of the theft, but nobody had come forward to report it. Hawk had always been cautious, but overconfidence, it seemed, was not a risk he could afford to take forever. The investigation quickly focused on Mark Rivers. Though he had retired quietly, his financial records revealed sudden inflows of capital over the years. Modest, but consistent with someone who might have had access to a fraction of the stolen money. Interviews with family and friends suggested a man who carried a heavy burden of secrecy and anxiety. "He never slept well," Rivers' son would later say. "And he always checked the locks 3 times even at home." Something followed him for years. Hargrove theorized that Hawk and his team had left intentional clues, knowing that 20 years later, someone might pick up the trail. The photograph and coordinates seemed deliberately placed to challenge Langford and the authorities. A test, a taunt, or perhaps a confession waiting to be decoded. By late 2015, Hargrove's team had assembled a cross-disciplinary unit: forensic accountants, retired military strategists, and criminal psychologists. Their goal was to reconstruct the heist in minute detail, simulate the escape routes, and identify potential hiding places for the stolen money. Using the coordinates, satellite imagery, and historical maps, the team began narrowing down the possibilities. The investigation also reached out to federal authorities, who were intrigued by the meticulous planning and audacity of the crime. While the investigation was gaining momentum, Rivers became increasingly agitated. The old journals he had kept, filled with panicked notations and cryptic references, became a source of both clarity and concern. One entry read, "If they ever come looking, the money is not where they think it is. The rest will be discovered only if I survive the decision I made." The ambiguity left the detectives guessing. Was Rivers cooperating? Was he hiding a part of the money? Or had he feared Hawk's retribution for 2 decades of silence? Hargrove also contacted Ellen Parker, the neighbor who had observed the motorcycles in 1995. Though decades older, her recollection was remarkably detailed. She described the motorcycles as unusual models, heavily modified, and the riders as moving with military precision. "I remember thinking they weren't from around here," she said. "They moved like shadows, smooth, deliberate, impossible to catch." Her testimony reinforced the theory that the heist had been meticulously planned, relying on precise timing, inside knowledge, and expert execution. As the investigation deepened, new patterns began to emerge. The stolen money had not been spent recklessly. Small transfers suggested careful concealment. Investigators theorized that Hawk and his team may have hidden the bulk of the cash in a remote location, one known only to them. Clues in Rivers' journal hinted at a staging ground, a location familiar from his daily logistics operations. By the summer of 2016, the team had identified a few high-probability areas outside Charleston. Some were abandoned warehouses. Others were remote wooded parcels previously mapped for utility easements. Using a combination of geospatial analysis and historical traffic records, the investigators began conducting systematic searches. Every step of the investigation revealed new layers of complexity. The criminals had anticipated law enforcement patterns, deliberately leaving decoys and false trails. Even 20 years later, the psychological impact of the heist lingered. Langford, haunted by paranoia, walked his estate nightly. Rivers wrestled with guilt and fear, and Hawk, wherever he was, seemed always one step ahead. Hargrove reflected on the unusual nature of the case. This wasn't just theft. It was a study in human psychology, trust, fear, greed, and patience. Then in late 2016 a breakthrough arrived. A retired delivery truck driver, recalling unusual behavior 2 decades prior, mentioned seeing a small, nondescript pickup near a forgotten industrial site, exactly where the coordinates from the photograph led. This tip reinvigorated the investigation and pointed to the first concrete lead in 20 years. The stage was set for a confrontation between past and present, for the unraveling of a meticulously constructed crime, and for answers that had been buried with silence and fear. The hunt for Hawk, Rivers' role, and the missing $2.5 million was no longer a matter of speculation. It was active, deliberate, and perilously close to discovery. By early 2017, the investigation had intensified. Detective Simon Hargrove's team had followed a labyrinth of leads: abandoned warehouses, old shipping yards, and wooded parcels on the outskirts of Charleston. Every tip, every memory from retired drivers, security personnel, and neighbors became a piece in a decades-old puzzle. Slowly, a pattern emerged: a carefully constructed network of hidden caches, decoys, and misleading trails designed to misdirect authorities for 20 years. The breakthrough came from a retired industrial mechanic named Frank Mulligan. In a quiet interview, Mulligan recalled an abandoned shipping container he had serviced years earlier, located in a remote lot south of Charleston. He remembered it distinctly because, at the time, it had been sealed with an unusual combination lock, not standard for the company. When Hargrove's team cross-referenced this with the coordinates from the photograph in Langford's mailbox, the alignment was uncanny. It was the first tangible lead on the missing $2.5 million. Hargrove organized a discreet operation. They approached the container under cover of night, using minimal personnel to avoid alerting anyone who might still be watching. The container itself bore the patina of age: rust creeping along its hinges, dust layered on the floor, and faint traces of tire tracks from decades ago. The air smelled faintly of oil and decay. Inside, beneath a pile of industrial crates and discarded equipment, lay the unmistakable shapes of 3 cash containers, identical to the ones Langford had last handled in 1995. The electronic alarms had long since failed, and the mechanical locks were corroded, but the money was intact. Simultaneously, Hargrove tracked down Mark Rivers, who had maintained a low-profile life in a suburban neighborhood. Confronting him was delicate. He was fragile, haunted, and defensive. At first, Rivers denied knowledge of the stash, his voice trembling. I don't know what you think I know," he stammered. But under the weight of evidence, his old journals, inconsistencies in financial records, and corroboration from the recovered containers, he confessed. Rivers admitted to coordinating elements of the heist under duress from Hawk, though he claimed he had never intended for anyone to be harmed. He explained that Hawk had operated with military precision, training the accomplices, planning escape routes, and planting false trails. Rivers' conscience had grown heavy over the years, and the photograph and coordinates sent to Langford, he claimed, were not from Hawk but from an unknown intermediary, possibly a remorseful member of Hawk's team seeking closure. The final piece of the puzzle was Tony Hawk DeLuca himself. Hargrove's investigators discovered he had moved overseas shortly after the heist, adopting a new identity in Eastern Europe. Years of surveillance, digital forensics, and cross-border cooperation finally led to his capture in 2018. Hawk was found living quietly in a small town, never having spent the stolen money publicly, instead letting it lie dormant in hidden caches. When confronted, he maintained a stoic demeanor. 20 years is nothing when a man is patient, he said calmly. I never lost the money, nor did I intend to. The legal proceedings were complex. Rivers received leniency in exchange for cooperation, highlighting Hawk's meticulous orchestration of the crime. Hawk faced charges both domestically and internationally, though statutes of limitations and jurisdictional issues complicated immediate sentencing. Langford, finally reunited with his money, reflected quietly on the long shadow of greed and trust. The money was only part of it. It was the betrayal, the planning, the patience, that changed everything. The case left a lasting impression on Charleston. Law enforcement revised protocols for armored transport and security monitoring, emphasizing redundancy and human factor oversight. The public, captivated by the audacity of the heist and the decades-long mystery, followed the case in news reports and documentaries. Psychologically, the aftermath was profound. Rivers struggled with lingering guilt and trauma, Hawke expressed a cold sense of vindication, and Langford had to reconcile relief with the lingering bitterness of betrayal. For decades, the stolen $2.5 million had been more than currency. It had become a symbol of secrecy, ambition, and the extraordinary lengths to which human planning and patience could extend. As Hargrove closed the file, he reflected on the remarkable alignment of time, memory, and perseverance that led to resolution. 20 years, he said, and every shadow, every decision, every whisper mattered. In the end, the truth was patient. And patience has its own justice. The stolen cash was recovered. The criminals faced justice, and Charleston could finally put to rest a chapter that had haunted its streets for 2 decades. Yet, the story remained a testament to the extraordinary human capacity for planning, deception, and, ultimately, the persistence of consequence. The sun rose slowly over Charleston, casting long shadows across the streets that had once whispered the secrets of a heist so precise it seemed almost cinematic. 2 decades had passed since the armored car vanished with $2.5 million in cash, yet the city still felt the ripple of that audacious theft. Though the physical traces of the crime had been resolved, the money recovered, the criminals confronted, and the case officially closed, its imprint remained in subtle ways, etched into the lives of those involved. Richard Langford, the billionaire whose wealth had made him both a target and a symbol, lived now with the quiet discomfort of hindsight. The recovery of his fortune offered little comfort for the years of suspicion, betrayal, and sleepless nights that had defined his post-heist life. He had spent years meticulously auditing every transaction, scrutinizing every employee, and obsessively guarding his estate. The epilogue of the heist was not just financial restoration, it was an emotional reckoning. Langford's reflections were stark. He recognized, with painful clarity, that the crime had been as much about human failings as about greed. Trust had been the currency Hawke and his accomplices had manipulated most effectively. The betrayal of Mark Rivers, a man who had balanced desperation and morality for decades, cut deeper than any loss of cash. Langford, in quiet interviews years later, would confess, "The money was tangible, but the loss of certainty, of safety, of faith in people, that was the cost I never calculated." Mark Rivers, now elderly and worn, carried the psychological weight of his complicity. The 2 decades of secrecy, of fear that every knock at the door might bring discovery or retribution, had left indelible marks. His cooperation in the final investigation had brought some measure of closure, yet it also forced him to confront a life defined by choices he could never undo. Nights were long, filled with dreams of that garage, the hum of motorcycles, the cold metal of cash containers under his hands. "I told myself it was survival," he admitted in a rare interview, "but survival was always a lie. I betrayed more than money, I betrayed myself." Tony Hawk, DeLuca's capture and subsequent legal proceedings became a study in human patience and detachment. In court, his demeanor was unervingly calm. He articulated a philosophy rooted in precision, timing, and patience. 20 years is nothing. The world moves, people forget, but the plan endures. Legal teams struggled to reconcile the audacity of his strategy with statutes and jurisdictional limitations. He faced charges that were partially mitigated by the age of the crime, but the symbolic victory of law enforcement proved that even the most calculated criminals could eventually be held accountable. The broader Charleston community, for its part, experienced the subtle reverberations of the case for decades. Business protocols changed, armored transport security was revised, and corporate executives grew hyper-aware of the intersection between human error and technological reliability. The heist became a cautionary tale in seminars, training sessions, and even academic studies on criminal psychology and security management. The investigative team, led by Detective Simon Hargrove, reflected deeply on the interplay of chance, preparation, and human behavior that defined the Langford heist. Hargrove often noted that this case was as much a study of psychology as of crime. The meticulousness of Hawke's planning demonstrated the extremes of human patience, the way fear and desire could be manipulated, and how long-term secrecy could become a prison in itself. Financially, the recovered $2.5 million was a drop in the ocean for Langford's empire, yet the symbolic weight of its return was immense. For Rivers, it represented the tangible measure of his complicity, a physical reminder of the choices that had shaped his life. For Hawke, it was validation of a strategy that had worked for decades, a bitter victory colored by the inevitability of eventual justice. The epilogue also extends to the unseen threads, the intermediaries who had helped Hawke and Rivers, the unsuspecting neighbors, and even the forgotten employees who had unwittingly facilitated small steps in the heist. Each had a story, a memory, a fragment of participation that shaped the eventual outcome. The human ecosystem of a crime, Hargrove would later write, is rarely as simple as perpetrators and victims. It is a web of motivations, fears, loyalties, and compromises. 20 years of hidden money, secrets, and shadows left their mark on Charleston's law enforcement as well. Protocols were rewritten, training intensified, and forensic techniques expanded. The city itself seemed altered, its citizens reminded that audacity and patience could produce extraordinary criminal feats, yet that even the most careful plans could unravel in the face of persistent observation and moral reckoning. Hargrove, reflecting on the closure of the case, often described the final confrontation with Hawke as anticlimactic in form but monumental in consequence. The man who had orchestrated years of deception stood quietly, facing decades of delayed justice. It was never about the money for him, Hargrove mused. It was about proving something: patience, control, inevitability. And yet, inevitability always has its limits. The psychological aftermath for all involved was profound. Langford learned to live with trust restored yet tinged with caution. Rivers lived in the shadow of his own decisions, burdened yet liberated by eventual disclosure. Hawke, captured and judged, remained unrepentant in attitude but constrained in consequence. And the city itself learned that the extraordinary audacity of crime is often matched only by the extraordinary patience of justice. Even decades later, the story of the heist became legend, a case study in criminal psychology, corporate security, and the human capacity for meticulous planning and moral compromise. For journalists, historians, and law enforcement alike, it remained a testament to how one night of calculated audacity could ripple across 20 years of lives, decisions, and consequences. The final image, the one that would linger in the minds of those who followed the case, was not of cash, nor motorcycles, nor a hidden container. It was a photograph of shadows stretched long across Charleston streets at dawn, evidence of patience, fear, ambition, and inevitability, the silent markers of human nature itself. And in the end, the true lesson of the Langford heist was not the money recovered, nor the criminals captured. It was that human ingenuity and human error are intertwined, that choices echo across decades, and that even when the world changes, the past waits patiently, ready to reveal its truths.